Well, welcome everybody on this Friday morning for this lecture of Ian McNiven about Beyond Bridges and Barriers, Torres Strait and Curious Artifacts Distribution between Queensland and New Guinea. We're very happy to have Ian here all the way from Australia. And he will be about half an hour. After the lecture, you can ask questions in the Q&A or by raising your hand, and then I can unmute you. Well, I give the word to Ian, and I'll see you later. I will be back.
Okay, thank you, Jeanette.
Okay, thank you.
That it's working. Everybody can see that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you, Jeanette, for the kind invitation to speak to the Amsterdam Tribal Art Fair. Just by way of introduction, you can see there on the screen. So I'm an anthropological archaeologist from Monash University here in Melbourne. And Melbourne, we're on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. So I'd like to pay my respects to many of the members of the Kulin Nation, particularly the Wurundjeri people, who many of them who are my friends and who I work with, have worked with over many years. So, but also a shout out to all the people in Torres Strait who I've worked with for nearly 25 years now, doing my archaeological research with various communities there. But it's not just archaeological work that I'm interested in. I'm very interested in ethnographic objects and what that can tell us about the human story of our part of the world. So, and I want to take you through some of what I'm calling the curious artifact distributions between New Guinea through Torres Strait and coming into the northeastern part of Australia, which of course is the state of Queensland. Okay, so what limits the geographical distribution of artifacts? So anybody who's interested in tribal art or collecting objects, provenance, in terms of geographical provenance, where objects come from and who made them, everybody's interested in that. And that sometimes working that out can be easier said than done. It's all right if that information stays with the object after it was collected, but as we know, often that gets lost, as it gets passed down through the objects get passed down through the generations. And this is where sort of studies or books, etc., that have this information can be extremely useful, as can sort of museum catalogues, etc. So, but what actually determines how far a particular object type goes? Well, in many ways, that comes down to two basic cultural processes here. So you have the diffusion of the idea of the object. So people can find out about an object and then they go away and make it themselves. So you have multiple sort of points of manufacture. Or in fact, you can have quite a limited place or areas where objects are made and maybe only one location, but the object that object type is found over a big area because of trade and exchange. So, but how far do objects go? That becomes an interesting question that I want to look at here. So my focus for the talk is artifact distributions between New Guinea and Australia via Torres Strait. And I want to look at Torres Strait as a barrier to object distributions. In the second part, Torres Strait as a bridge, facilitating the distribution of objects, and then trying to make sense of these two ideas of bridge and barrier through the role of canoe highways, and hopefully that will make a little bit more sense as I progress through the talk. So where are we? Well, there I am in the bottom sort of lower right-hand corner of Australia, so on the southern hemisphere on the other side of the planet. So this is my sort of area of interest for the talk. Here we go, a more detailed map. You'll get to know these maps pretty well. So obviously you've got the island of New Guinea to the north of Australia, split into Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. Then we come down into Queensland in the northeastern part of the continent of Australia. And there, of course, is Torres Strait, that 150 kilometre wide waterway that separates New Guinea, Papua New Guinea from from Australia. So let's look at Torres Strait as a barrier to object distributions. Now, this idea of Torres Strait as a barrier to object distributions is nothing new. Certainly, many anthropologists in the 19th century talked about the important role of Torres Strait as some sort of boundary or barrier to different sort of cultural traits. And this is some of the sort of the language that was used at the time. So it was certainly seen as being an important racial or cultural boundary between Papuans and Melanesians through the island of New Guinea, and then coming down into Australia with Aboriginal people. So there was something quite profound going on at that interface there through Torres Strait. Culturally, in terms of cultural practices, one of the big ones was that Torres Strait was seen as, in many ways, the world's great agricultural or horticultural frontier. So, and beyond Melanesia, beyond agricultural Papua and Papuans and Melanesians, south of Torres Strait was the world of hunting and gathering peoples, or the continent of hunter-gatherers. So again, something quite profoundly different happening to the north and to the south of Torres Strait. And this also got expressed in material cultural objects. One of the classic ones that 19th century people talked about was that essentially you had pottery everywhere in the world, also coming down through New Guinea. But then once you go into Torres Strait and move into Australia, there is no ethnographic evidence at all for Aboriginal Australians, or indeed Torres Strait Islanders, ever making pottery. But of course, we have a lot of ethnographic information for Melanesian peoples making pottery in the 19th century, and indeed continuing to make pottery today in many areas. And another object type that sort of amused particularly many mariners was the lack of bows and arrows in Australia, but you do find them in Torres Strait and New Guinea. So all up, you can see that there's quite a good strong case that there is something very different going on to the north and south of Torres Strait culturally on quite a grand scale. So this is why many anthropologists in the 19th century thought Torres Strait was such a fascinating area as this major cultural boundary in terms of world's cultures. So, but here's a question I've got. So does the 19th century idea of Torres Strait as a cultural barrier between New Guinea and Australia hold up to modern scrutiny? So what I want to do is take you through some research I've been doing, and I want to explore this idea of a boundary with objects by creating a series of ethnographic object distribution maps to help us sort of better understand what people in the 19th century were also trying to understand. So how have I gathered my information? Well, I've created quite a large database of the locations of a number of different sort of object types and where they're found in that study area there, represented by that map. The sources of information I've been using is what would be known to many of you. So we have ethnographic texts, catalogues for different museums and object collections. So I've just got some of them here. I've used hundreds of them, but this is just the spread that I put on the screen for you. So, and I mean, everybody knows Paul Wirtz's work with the Marin. And of course, the top right there, the famous Torres Strait anthropological expedition of Alfred Haddon from Cambridge University, 6 volumes of ethnographic information, and Haddon loved objects. So there's a lot of information there about the use of different object types. And then we have sort of the extraordinary volumes that document contemporary collections, such as the Jollica collection of from the New Guinea Highlands. Historical photographs, I've looked at those as well to see what people are wearing or holding. So an example here, the Frank Hurley collection from Papua. And I've just put up this one here it's a Memoirs of the Queensland Museum. It's only just been released, this volume. It's nearly 500 pages. And it's about the Sir William McGregor collection of ethnographic objects from Papua or British New Guinea. And it is filled with information about ethnographic objects, and it's lavishly illustrated. So, as I said, that has just come out. 500 pages. You can buy it for 60 Australian dollars, or just by logging on to the Queensland Museum website. So I highly recommend that volume. It's quite wonderful. And of course, the other great source of information is the huge amount of work that people in a range of museums have been doing in Europe, but in the UK as well, of creating these online catalogues of objects. So, I mean, the British Museum is a famous one where you can go and see different objects, but also, of course, the famous Pitt Rivers Museum. So I've scoured these catalogues as well for objects that, but particularly objects that have a very good sort of geographical location for the object. If the object that sort of says, well, it was collected from New Guinea, that's not really useful for me because I want to put a dot on the map. So it has to be quite specific information. So, as I said, a lot of the objects, they've lost that information. You could probably make a good guess where they're coming from, but I don't want to do that. I'm only going to use objects where the ethnographic information, where it comes from, is actually goes with the object, and that hasn't been lost. Okay, so taking all that data, let's look at the idea of the barrier, the 19th century idea, and so what I want to do is there's actually two types of distribution maps you can create here. The first one is to illustrate the barrier idea, is objects that are found across New Guinea and Torres Strait, but not in Queensland. So they're only found in a sense north of Torres Strait, or mostly north of Torres Strait. Then you have another set of objects where they're found, in fact, in Queensland and Torres Strait, but not in New Guinea. So let's have a look at the first one, where objects found in New Guinea and Torres Strait, but not Queensland. And I've just got a couple of examples here. I don't have to go into it in all the great detail, but these examples at least illustrate the point that I want to make. The first one of the famous cone shell armbands of Melanesia. I'm sure many of you are well aware of these. So, and for these different object types, I've got a number of photographs just showing people wearing these objects to give a little bit of sort of cultural context. So, cone shell armbands. So it's obviously created from a cone shell or part of the outside wall of the shell that's been sawn into these sections, often elaborated and decorated with, whether more recently with glass beads, but all sorts of other sort of tassels, etc. So if we take this map, okay, and I populate it with the dots where I've been able to locate these cone shell armbands, and this is where I've been able to find them. So you can see that they go from the right-hand side there through the Trobriand Islands, which is famous for these objects, along the south coast of Papua New Guinea, and then coming into Torres Strait, but I have found no records at all for these objects going south of Torres Strait into the northern part of Queensland or any part of Australia. So quite a restricted distribution there. And this distribution has got nothing to do with raw material availability. Cone shells are found across the tropical parts of Melanesia, and they're also found throughout the tropical parts of Queensland, particularly along the Great Barrier Reef. So it's not like Aboriginal peoples of Queensland didn't have access to cone shells. They're not making these objects, but their northern neighbours are, Torres Strait, Papua New Guinea. Okay, another one that really illustrates this border boundary idea, dog-tooth adornments. So again, most people are well aware of what are these objects. Made from the incisors, both upper and lower of dogs. We've got a couple of illustrations here, including the Marinda Nim, this fella here, and a young woman there from Port Moresby. So again, take the map. Where have I been able to locate these? So spread over obviously a large area of New Guinea, coming in south into Torres Strait, but no evidence at all that Aboriginal peoples extracted the teeth out of dogs to create body adornments. There's one or two items that have been found in various parts of Australia, but literally we're talking about one or two objects, and the origin of those is sometimes not quite well understood and what's going on there. So, but the big picture is basically Aboriginal people did not make dog tooth body adornments. And again, this is nothing to do with the availability of dog's teeth. There are dogs, the New Guinea singing dog throughout Melanesia. That makes sense. That's where the dog tooth necklaces and body adornments are. But Aboriginal people have the dingo, the famous dingo. So that they certainly had access to dog's teeth if they wanted them, but they didn't use them. So in Torres Strait is the border boundary there. Stone-headed clubs. Everybody who knows anything about Melanesian material culture certainly knows about stone-headed clubs. They come in various sort of shapes and sizes, sort of flying saucer disc shapes, or the sort of the spiked star-shaped or pineapple-headed clubs. And again, you get them in Melanesia and Torres Strait, but not Australia. So again, here's the map. This is where I've been able to find specific point locations, spot locations for these items. So across various parts of Papua New Guinea, moving into Indonesian, New Guinea, Papua as well, coming down into Torres Strait, but no evidence at all that Aboriginal peoples from mainland Australia made these or used these objects. Okay, so now let's flip it around and have a look at a different way of defining the border. That is, objects that are found in Queensland and Torres Strait, but don't go into New Guinea. So the first one is spear throwers with a shell handle. So Australia, many different groups across Australia use the spear thrower or woomera. They come in all different sort of shapes and sizes, and if you're any good on these objects, you can pretty much work out what part of Australia they are from. But certainly in northern part of Queensland, you have a very distinctive type of spear thrower, as you can see here in the illustrations, that have the shell handle on one end, and that's a section, an oval section, or they have two pieces of shell, oval sections that are sort of glued together. That it's made out of a baler shell. So they're very distinctive, regionally distinct to the northern part of Queensland or the Cape York Peninsula area. But again, distribution map, here we go, this is where they're found. So only across the northern part of Queensland, but some were traded up into Torres Strait. We have no evidence that Torres Strait Islanders made them. All the evidence speaks to importing them from Cape York Aboriginal peoples, and certainly Alfred Haddon documented that these objects were traded into Torres Strait from the northern part of mainland Queensland, but I can find no evidence that they went further north than Torres Strait. Another one is nautilus shell headbands. Now we know that nautilus shells were made into various body adornments in some parts of Melanesia, but what I'm talking about here is a very distinctive type of headband that's made from very small little beads that are carved out of a nautilus shell. You can see some illustrations there. And they've got one of Haddon's famous photographs from Murray Island or Mare in the eastern part of Torres Strait. You can see the man there wearing one of these nautilus shell headbands across his forehead there. And again, when you do the distributions, here they are. So got a couple of examples from Torres Strait, but then there's other examples that come down the coast of the northern part of Queensland, but you don't find these objects in Melanesia. And again, this has nothing to do with raw material availability. There's plenty of nautilus shells that get washed up on the beaches of New Guinea, but they're not made into these objects. These are very specific to Torres Strait and Aboriginal peoples of North Queensland. All right, so going back to our question, does the 19th century idea of Torres Strait as a cultural barrier between New Guinea and Australia hold up to modern scrutiny? Well, in the sense, yes, it does. And I've just shown you a whole lot of maps there that show that Torres Strait is a border or some sort of barrier to the movement of objects, either moving north or moving south. But there's some qualifications. There's a big but here, and this is where it starts getting interesting. So, because it's letting us know that the story is a little bit more complicated. And this is when I want to look at Torres Strait as a bridge. So we've just looked at it as a barrier to the movement of objects either coming south or moving north. But what about objects that actually do move north and south? So you find them in New Guinea, you find objects also in Torres Strait, but sorry, that should be, and Queensland as well. So I've got a couple of examples here that really illustrate this. The first one is bamboo tobacco pipes. So many of you would be well aware of these pipes made of sections of bamboo, often with elaborate engraving on the surface to create often quite regionally distinctive designs. So, but again, you get examples coming from New Guinea, coming from Torres Strait, and also Aboriginal peoples of North Queensland using these pipes to smoke tobacco as well. So when you do the distribution map, there you go, look at that. So no way is Torres Strait some sort of barrier or boundary for the distribution and the uptake of bamboo smoking pipes in this part of the world. But you can see that they're throughout many parts of Melanesia, through Torres Strait, and then coming down into Aboriginal peoples of mainland Queensland. And I've got another example here. So again, cone shells, but not the outside world that was made into the armbands that I talked about before, which are only found in Torres Strait and in the southern part of Papua New Guinea. You do get them in some parts of West Papua as well, but they're off my map. But this is the end of the cone shells. So you saw the end off the shell, the spire, and you get a disc adornment, body adornment, which usually got a hole, a perforation to either suspend it around the neck or attach it to other body adornments as well. So again, you've got examples from New Guinea, from Torres Strait, and the man there on the right, that's an Aboriginal person from Cape York Peninsula in North Queensland, wearing one of these cone shell body adornments. So again, the distribution map here, so you can see through many parts of Melanesia, coming into Torres Strait, but also Aboriginal peoples of North Queensland. And the ethnographic evidence would suggest that while there might be some trade in these objects moving south into the far northern part of mainland Queensland, there's other evidence suggests that they were also made as well by Aboriginal peoples. But interestingly, they're making these objects, but they're not making or using the armbands. So there's some sort of difference going on there. Okay, so these curious object distributions give rise to two questions. First, so why were some objects shared across New Guinea and Northeast Australia, Queensland, including Torres Strait, so the bridge idea? Whilst on the other hand, why did some New Guinea objects not move south of Torres Strait into Queensland, and some Queensland objects not move north of Torres Strait into New Guinea, the barrier idea that we were talking about? So what's going on here? And this is what I want to get into, and I think this helps explain what's going on, the role of canoe highways. So what I've done here on this map is I've plotted, using a wide range of ethnographic information, on the known sort of voyaging or exchange networks and canoe highways across the southern part of Papua New Guinea, coming through Torres Strait, and then also historical records that talk about Torres Strait Islanders cruising down the east side of Cape York there, in fact, cruising down 600 kilometres to Lizard Island. Right, so Lizard Island's quite an important place because it's the most southern extension that we know of Torres Strait Islander voyaging. So, and they're using these very, very large ocean-going canoes that are up to 21 metres. They had very large sails, etc. So these are major expeditions that are performed by Torres Strait Islanders. So they're moving down and they're stopping off and communicating with all sorts of Aboriginal groups. There's some trade and an exchange of ideas, and that same idea of stopping off and chatting to people, swapping ideas, etc., sometimes exchanging objects, can be found all the way along, going right out to past the Trobriand Islands and the Massam area there. So what we end up having, if you join all these with black sort of arrows together, you end up getting something like 2,000 kilometres of linked canoe highways and information object exchange networks. So technically, it is possible that an idea that is found on Lizard Island can somehow be passed along the canoe highways and end up even going right around the southern part of past Port Moresby, even going out to the Trobriand. Now, we have no evidence that that in fact did happen. There's some linguistic evidence that talks about the diffusion of language terms throughout this entire area, but in terms of particular objects, that we don't know that in fact certain objects would start in one end and end up in the other. However, the idea of these objects obviously is moving, and we've seen that. So you do get information and object sharing going on throughout this area, and things like the bamboo pipes and the tops of the cone shell objects, which everybody on this in these canoe sort of highways, everybody's sort of sharing those ideas. That tells us that the ideas are being shared and people do know about them. But in other contexts, they're being very selective in what they take. So, and this is why we get Torres Strait as a boundary. So it's not that people, for example, objects that are found in Queensland and Torres Strait, it's not that the people in New Guinea, in the southern part here, didn't know about these objects. They would have known about them, but they've decided it's not for them, right? And that's quite critical. And that's what these canoe trading systems show us, is that there is a sharing of ideas. People know about these objects. Sometimes everybody decides to be on the same page, but in other instances, they decide not to be. And they're quite selective in what they decide that they will use. So this is what we get. So some objects are shared, such as bamboo pipes, but other objects, we're getting quite a bit of selection. So, so what it's about is that people are exercising choice in the uptake of objects. It's not that people didn't know about these objects. The canoe highways, the information exchange is telling us they did know about them, but they're deciding not to take certain objects up. You know, and that's the critical point, and that's what the canoe highways are telling us. So how old are these sort of canoe highways and exchange networks that I've been talking about? This information you've got here on the map, this is an ethnographic information. So this is late 19th century, early 20th century information. And of course, those museum objects I've been talking about, again, essentially most of them would be late 19th century, some early 20th century objects. But how far back in time does this go? Well, this is where it gets into the sort of things that I do as my day job, which is an archaeologist. And I've done work in the southern part of Papua New Guinea, a lot of work in Torres Strait, and I've also done work in Cape York Peninsula. In fact, I've done work on Lizard Island, which I want to sort of show you about now. I'll introduce you to some of this work. Pottery, I think, gives us a good handle on the potential depth, age depth of this what I might call a coral sea interaction sphere here. So these yellow dots, this is where we know pottery was made ethnographically in the area taken in by this map. So essentially you're talking about the eastern part of Papua New Guinea, right? There's no ethnographic information that Torres Strait Islanders made pottery, like I said at the beginning of the talk. No evidence at all that Aboriginal people ever made pottery as well. But in the last year or so, this story has changed quite dramatically. The pink dots show you where we've found archaeological evidence for, in a sense, prehistoric pottery manufacture. And these are locations where the pottery has been dated between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. And a lot of this pottery, I've actually been involved in the excavations, particularly around Port Moresby, also the pottery that's been found, the ancient pottery in Torres Strait, but also the excavations that we've done on Lizard Island as well. So Lizard Island, it's used by Aboriginal people. There's a number of communities where Lizard Island is part of their marine territory. But like I said, there's no evidence Aboriginal people made pottery. Well, that changed about a year ago when we did an excavation there, and we found pottery dated between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. 2,000 to 3,000 years old also in Torres Strait. So Torres Strait Islanders, they used to make pottery. So this is way before Haddon's time. So certainly Haddon went there. People said, we never made pottery. Well, but they used to, but you had to go back 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. So it's interesting that if you look at the pottery, it tells us that this distribution of canoe networks and the sharing of ideas goes back at least 2,000 to 3,000 years. And the pottery tells us that, the archaeology tells us that. But then you come through time, the pottery drops out of people's cultural and material culture repertoires to the point where you get into the 19th century with these yellow dots and these ideas of ancient pottery in Torres Strait and with Aboriginal peoples, that those ideas are now lost and had to await sort of the work of archaeologists to find that out. So just to conclude, so what do we got here with this brief talk? So that canoe highways allowed international sharing of ideas between New Guinea and Australia via Torres Strait. Sharing of ideas saw shared uptake of some objects and selective uptake of other objects. People exercised agency and choice to share or reject objects. And Torres Strait remains an important border for object distributions, and that these processes operated for at least 2,000 to 3,000 years. The pottery tells us that. So I might leave it at that, and thank you. And if you would like more detail about what I've been talking about with this talk, there's a couple of publications there. If you missed the details there, just send me an email. I'm more than happy to send you copies of those. I'm pretty easy to find on the, just Google me. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting talk.